A game as complex as Pokemon has a lot of interactions. Some of them, when you see them, you're like, what? Why? How? Even as a longtime player and content creator of the game, I didn't even know half of these interactions on this list existed. Granted, some of these are generation-specific mechanics, but still, incredibly mind-blowing. So today we're bringing you 10 in-battle mechanics that are strange, obscure, or in some other way, not all that well known, even for longtime players. And we're jumping right in with Mold Breaker, phasing moves, and entry hazards. A man has to be what he is, youngster Joey. Can't break the mold, unless Mold Breaker is the anti-ability ability, but simply, it ignores abilities that would thwart the full success of your move. Most famously, this allows Earthquake to hit Pokemon with Levitate, which would otherwise be immune. This is a particularly excellent trait of Haxorus, which allows it to really slam a would-be check in Bronzong and Excadrill, which lets it slice through its usually excellent counter Rotom Wash. It's also renowned for being tragically wasted on Rampardos. Anyways, though this is the most well-known example, Mold Breaker and its clone abilities, Terra Volt and Turbo Blaze, generally cut through immunities provided by abilities. See Kieran Black's Fusion Bolt smashing through Thunderous Therian's Volt Absorb. Beyond this, Mold Breaker and company also blast through Sturdy, meaning Sock's Choice Band Close Combat can one-hit KO Golem in spite of the latter's ability's built-in Focus Sash. And funnily enough, it even ignores Unaware. The mighty Quagsire may be able to fend off Zacian Crown and Extreme Killer Arceus, but even Quagsire cannot withstand Haxorus, which will hit it with the full force of its boost. Finally, Excadrill and Druddigon have used Mold Breaker's Stealth Rock, which ignores the bounce back effect of Magic Bounce. There are many other examples of the ignorable abilities that Mold Breaker denies, but these have been the most relevant competitively. However, you might notice that these examples all relate to direct, immediate effect. There's nothing like Toxic suddenly doing damage to a Magic Guard or Poison Heal Pokemon. This is because Mold Breaker isn't like other ability suppressing abilities or moves like Neutralizing Gas or Gastro Acid, which deny the opponent's ability entirely. Mold Breaker simply ignores an opponent's ability for the execution of its move. There's nothing stopping you from using Toxic on a Magic Guard Reuniclus. The Reuniclus just won't take any damage after the move is over. This is exactly what makes this particular mechanic so strange, and it's certainly not one you're at all likely to actually encounter in battle. In fact, in Gen 4, you can't encounter it at all, as it didn't come into play until Gen 5. Starting there, if a Pokemon with Mold Breaker uses a phasing move that drags in a Pokemon with Levitate, it will be affected by Spikes and Toxic Spikes, either finding a loophole or applying the same logic that would allow Earthquake to hit the Levitator, depending on how you look at it. It's consistent, though a Poison type with Levitate getting dragged in like this would actually absorb Toxic Spikes. It's incredibly unlikely to actually see this take place because of all the Mold Breaker Pokemon in the game, only Druddigon is ever going to be using a phasing move. Defensive Druddigon sets that run Dragon Tail are usually going to be using Rough Skin as their ability, and even if you did have Mold Breaker Dragon Tail Druddigon, it's hardly a guarantee you're going to be dragging Levitate Pokemon in with Spikes down. Not impossible, but well, there's a reason that unless you like looking obscure mechanics up, even a long tenured competitive player is unlikely to know that this mechanic exists. They never have to put Mold Breaker and phasing together, and they're never going to actually run into it. If asked, the closest association you'd have with Mold Breaker and phasing would be that the ability would let Roar go through Magic Bounce, Soundproof, and Good as Gold. It almost doesn't even make sense that Mold Breaker would bypass Levitate in such a quasi-roundabout, indirect way. Almost. However strange though it is, it's not quite the defiance of the type chart mechanics of our next choice, in which steel types can be poisoned. But before we go into the next wacky mechanic, we're sponsored by something we already use, because this video is sponsored by Rocket Money. Look, I watch a lot of streaming services. Sometimes I forget one of the many free trials I signed up for with my credit card, and then all of a sudden, there's a subscription charge I didn't expect. I know this has happened to you too. Luckily, thanks to Rocket Money, I will never forget to unsubscribe to your subscription service ever again. Before I used Rocket Money, there were hundreds of dollars unknowingly being taken from me, admittingly because of my own forgetfulness, but it becomes overwhelming having to remember so many. Rocket Money can even cancel them for you, and in just a few taps too. Rocket Money may even be able to try to get you some refund money for lost money. I love saving money, and I'm glad Rocket Money is here because they have saved up to $740 a year when you use all of the app's premium features. They've also helped members save over $880 million in canceled subscriptions. So if you want the best budgeting and saving app and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can go to my link in the description below to try Rocket Money for free, or go to rocketmoney.com/fallswipe to try premium features. the poison-type immune steel types are vulnerable to the poison status condition. And no, we're not talking about Salazzle using its corrosion ability to toxic heat ran, as awesome as that is. In the second generation, steel types like Skarmory, Steelix, and Fortress are renowned for their longevity, which is in no small part thanks to their toxic immunity. On the extremely rare occasion that Swords Dance Tentacruel shows up, its stab Sludge Bomb will also do no damage whatsoever to them, rendering its otherwise nasty 30% poison rate useless. However, it is possible to poison steels. Granted, it's not in a way you're ever going to witness in a battle, at least not competitively. In-game, you might run into it, though it's still not very likely, but in a competitive battle, whoever does get their steel types poisoned would mostly be thanking their opponent for making the battle easier for them, as technically, Gen 2 steels aren't immune to the poison status. They're immune to being badly poisoned, i.e. the gradual buildup of toxic damage, and they're immune to poison type moves. Therefore, if there were a move that caused regular poison without being poison type itself, it could poison steels, and indeed that move exists. It is the bug type Twin Needle, and thus the problem is apparent. The 20% poison rate against steels is pretty nifty, but before you get any 3D chess ideas about upending the metagame, remember that Twin Needle is an effective 50 base power move that, in Gen 2, can only be learned by Beedrill, one of the very worst Pokemon in the game. As soon as you roll up with Beedrill, your opponent will be glad it wasn't, just about anything else. And forget OU, this also applies in the lowest tiers, where the steel type of choice is Magnemite. Plus, poisoning Skarmory doesn't exactly do much, since it can just rest it off, as can just about any rest user in the game, given those non-existent offenses. But wait, Smeargle can learn any move in the game, so it can also use Twin Needle. Can you perhaps use it in the filler slot on Elite Spike set to bait in and wear down Fortress trying to rapid spin? Yeah, until you remember Smeargle can also use Sacred Fire to do the same thing about 1,000,000 times better. Oh well, in Generation 3, the steel type became immune to regular poison as well as toxic poison, so Twin Needle was no longer able to slip through the cracks. Though at least it would be joined by Gen 4's Cycle Shift and Fling in this regard, it wouldn't be until Corrosion's introduction in Gen 7 that steels would become vulnerable to the status again, though that would be the first time it could be done viably, and not through what seemed to be more of a programming slip-up than intentional design. This one still makes some sense though, at least compared to our mind-boggling next choice, in which Trick Room and how even the slowest Pokemon can be outsped under it. Ever since its introduction in Gen 4, Trick Room's shimmering sense of possibility has thrilled players. It completely upends the most important stat in the game, speed, for a brief time. All those advantages you normally have for being faster are turned against you. Under Trick Room, the slower you go, the more you'll hit first. In fact, it's so incredible, unlike most other field effects, Game Freak has refused to even give it a duration extending item, let alone an ability that summons it on switch-in. Trick Room is a staple of VGC strategy. Its ephemeral style offset by the major payoffs whose setup and delivery are perfectly suited to the short turn counts of the 2v2 4-a-side format. It's not nearly as consistent in singles, not just for the longer games, but for how with the brief duration is further complicated by the setter usually having to then find a way to switch into the slow attacker, aiming to use Trick Room to its advantage. As such, Trick Room is usually used not as the basis of an entire team strategy, but instead on one Pokemon, like Gen 4 Bronzong, Gen 5 Uniclus, or Gen 7 Magearna, that can set the effect up for its own late game sweep, as a sort of quasi-agility that stands no chance at getting outsped by even the fastest Choice Scarfer. Or maybe not. Dealing with Trick Room can be tough, and many of us have joked about how you simply have to be so fast that you outspeed the Trick Room. But what most of us don't know is that, technically, this is how it actually works. At least starting in Gen 5. There, a Pokemon with a speed stat of 1,809 or higher will outspeed slower Pokemon even if Trick Room is active. It's actually even wilder than that. To be as specific as possible, the Pokemon whose speed stat is closest to 1809 without going under goes first under Trick Room. Basically, in the extremely farcical scenario where there are simultaneously multiple Pokemon of such a ludicrous speed stat on the field, Trick Room basically resets them at 1809. For example, a Pokemon with 1810 speed would go first against a Pokemon with 1811 speed. For the math buffs out there, this has to do with the actual formula applied to a Pokemon's speed stat under Trick Room. Now, these aren't speed stats that you have any chance of achieving without actively trying for it. You never run into them accidentally. Just about. And even if you have the idea that this is the anti-Trick Room meta breaker we've all been waiting for, consider just how absurd these requirements are. The fastest Pokemon in the game, Regieleki, reaches a maximum speed stat of 1096 after factor in agility. After 2 agilities, it reaches 1644. Only after a 3rd agility can it breach the 1809 mark, clocking in at an insane 2192. Now call me crazy, but the fastest Pokemon in the game maxing out its speed across 3 turns doesn't quite seem very efficient, nor particularly reliable for handling Trick Room, and it's not going to leave much, if any, room for other Pokemon to achieve the same feat either, at least not through any methods that aren't ridiculously convoluted and are actually worthwhile. Still, isn't it a strange yet satisfying feeling when something ridiculous you joked about actually turned out to be true? Now, speaking of strangeness, see how everything we know about resistances can be turned on its head when it fits Game Freak's whims, as it was in Gen 7, in which 1000 Arrows and the neutralizing of secondary typing. Game Freak felt so bad about depriving Zygarde of its own game, they broke the type chart for it. 1000 Arrows was akin to Earthquake that, for being slightly weaker, was rewarded by basically packing the built-in effect of Gravity or Iron Ball, as it hit everything immune to ground, like flying types and levitators most notably, but Pokemon holding Air Balloon or under the effect of Magnet Rise as well. Yes, even the famed Air Balloon Rotom fan would be affected, even if it somehow learned Magnet Rise to become the most ground-immune Pokemon possible. 1000 Arrows alone launched Zygarde from BL in its inaugural generation to Uber in Gen 7 and 8, while enabling Zygarde Complete and 10% in Ubers and the lower tiers respectively. You could spam arrows into almost everything. If it wasn't an already grounded grass or bug type, it'd be neutral. That's right, Game Freak pushed 1000 Arrows' type defined so far that it neutralized the secondary types of Pokemon that weren't grounded. This means even if you would resist ground after being grounded, like a grass flying type, that first hit of 1000 Arrows is still neutral. Once you're grounded, sure, you get the resist again, but 1000 Arrows needs to ground you first, and that first hit crucially removes the resist. Oh, it's fine, you can resist it after the first hit. It is of course utterly insane. More relevant example, imagine say Galarian Weezing unable to resist Iron Valiant's close combat until after the initial hit, which would leave it with a ton of damage taken. But the only reason this wasn't especially outrageous regarding Zygarde was because the Pokemon that were grass or bug and also flying or levitating weren't exactly very good to begin with. Nobody would have been using Tropius and Vikavolt to check Zygarde were it not for this mechanic. The fact that no such Pokemon existed or why this mechanic isn't too well known. Still, Game Freak really went all out in setting up Zygarde's redemption tour. The flip side of this mechanic, more known to the competitive player base, that does help the lack of resist part make more sense, was that 1000 Arrows would not instantly hit a Pokemon like Celesteela or Skarmory super effectively, despite their secondary type being ground weak. But this was of little comfort, given that on the next turn, they would indeed have gained their ground weakness and be at risk of Zygarde blasting through them like it did most everything else. We say this with great amusement, knowing how the eventuality of the infinitely threatening Mega Zygarde Complete looms over the competitive scene. And speaking of infinity, actually, this brings us to the first generation with Ditto and its Infinity War. Ditto set out to demonstrate the surrealism of identity and wound up caught in a never-ending loop where I art thou and thou art I. Ditto wasn't able to reach the full potential of transforming into the opponent's Pokemon until Black and White 2 gifted it the Imposter ability, allowing it to transform on switch-in, which gave it seemingly endless possibilities for coming into battle, as opposed to the impossible task of safely switching in, using Transform, and actually transforming into what your opponent wanted you to, which is why Ditto didn't exist competitively until then. One of the things that makes Ditto so good is that it has, in effect, infinite PP, since when it transforms into another Pokemon, it only has 5 PP of each of their moves, but the effect resets every time it switches in. Thus, many stall teams using Ditto could use it alongside a regenerator like Toxapex to either win long-term PP wars, or at least force a tie via a would-be endless battle against other bulky teams with their own regenerator, which Ditto would be able to copy and actually turn their own PP against them endlessly, as well as potentially being able to use recovery moves if needed without ever running out of the move if they were able to consistently switch to its teammates after. While that was much later, infinitely resetting PP on each transformation rolls around since the beginning, and anytime infinite PP comes up, endless battles are possible. Now, since Gen 2, you cannot transform into a Pokemon that's already transformed, but in Gen 1, there was no such stop in place. This meant if a battle somehow came down to last Pokemon Ditto versus last Pokemon Ditto, the battle would never end, because by virtue of having no other moves with which to damage each other, they would simply transform into each other over and over and over and over, and we'll stop there. Funnily enough, this could also happen in Ubers, as Transform Mew does exist there to counter opposing Transform Mew, and as standard Transform Mew doesn't actually use any attacking moves, it can't actually damage the opponent at all. So in the extremely unlikely event that both players bring Transform Mew and they wind up being the last Pokemon, the game would also go on infinitely, theoretically anyway. Discussions about Game Boy battery life aside, this infinite transformation also applied to the Japanese Pokemon Stadium, but Transform was fixed outside of Japan to fail well if the opponent's Pokemon was Ditto. Speaking of the perils of potentially endless battles, there was a time where the competitive community had to adjust the rule set with extreme specificity, in which Wobbuffet, the most underrated Team Rocket member, found itself unable to use an item that it quite would have liked. In Gen 4 Ubers, leftovers are a major assistance in helping Wobbuffet repeatedly trap and KO opponents with its Shadow Tag Counter Coat combination, or if not KO, then at least neutralize with Encore so a teammate can take advantage. Wobbuffet can still do these things without leftovers. Custberry Destiny Bond sets are quite good, but by and large it prefers lefties. It can also pull these tricks in Gen 3 Ubers, minus the yet to be added Custberry, but it's not allowed to run leftovers while doing so. It's not for being too overpowered with leftovers or anything like that. If you have any interest in Gen 3 Ubers, and you should, because it's a fascinating metagame, you might scroll the page for it and see in the rule set that Wobbuffet and its pre-evolution Wynaut are banned from holding leftovers. Why? Struggle, the default damage move you revert to when out of PP, makes you take a flat 25% of your maximum HP as recoil damage in Gen 4 and on. Before that though, Struggle's recoil was half of the damage dealt in Gen 1 and a quarter of the damage dealt in Gens 2 and 3. This wasn't a problem in Gen 1, as there were no leftovers, but in Gens 2 and 3, seeing as Struggle is merely 50 base power, you could very well deal Struggle damage whose recoil wouldn't out-damage your lefties. Not always. There were some amusing GSC scenarios where a max curse boosted Snorlax would threaten to win with Struggle, but this did indeed happen. Sometimes it could be an advantage if you were trying to waste opposing PP. Other times it could actually be a hindrance if you were trying to make your own Pokemon faint, so your Snorlax would be the last Pokemon and it could no longer have its curse boost roared out. Theoretically, you could have two last Pokemon face off that couldn't out-damage each other's leftovers, both from opposing Struggle damage and the recoil of their own. But if you manage to get into the situation, you just call a tie to avoid the otherwise infinite battle. Now imagine this happens, not at the end of a long battle once all other options are exhausted, but literally anytime two Pokemon face each other. That is what happens when two Wobbuffet holding leftovers are on the field. They are both trapped by the other's Shadow Tag, so there's no escape, and they have no moves other than to flail at each other haplessly with their non-damaging moves. After running out of PP, they will then begin to struggle, but Wobbuffet is so weak, it's not doing any damage to the other Wobbuffet, and thus isn't damaging itself with Struggle recoil either. And so the two Wobbuffet are trapped together for eternity. Existential stuff. This of course can't be allowed in a competitive metagame. Not only could a player choose to effectively end the game in a tie as a response to any KO their opponent took with Wobbuffet by sending in their own, it wouldn't even be necessarily avoidable. As just one example, what if both players switched to Wobbuffet on the same turn? However, banning Wobbuffet would be extreme, so it was instead restricted from holding leftovers instead, and why not two just in case. Gen 4 making Struggle deal so much more recoil damage, as well as making Shadow Tag Pokemon immune to other Shadow Tag, was almost surely a response to this. And speaking of recoil on Gen 4, there was a time where you could do so almost invisibly, in which your opponent had to pay close attention or they might miss it. Beginning in Gen 5, there would be an activation message telling you that the opposing Pokemon had taken recoil damage from its Life Orb, but Life Orb was introduced in the 4th gen, and back then, the 10% damage would simply be extracted from its user's HP stat without the activation message in the battle text. This meant that if your mind wandered or you looked away for a second, you might not notice that the opponent had lost a bit of its health, especially if it had already taken some prior damage. It's easy to notice when a Pokemon that's just come in at full health is hanging out around 90%, but you could definitely overlook the difference between, say, 75% and 65% if you're not careful. You can also have a phantom effect of thinking they're there when they're not. Sure, Infernape often runs Life Orb on mixed sets, so here you are thinking you're switching around to rack up recoil damage, only to realize after 3 turns, it's still at the same HP that it was when it switched in. Sometimes we got a little too used to the comfort of the battle log. Funnily enough, while this mechanic was present in the Gen 4 games, the first Gen 4 simulator, Shoddy Battle, incorporated the loss of 10% health into the battle log, as it had no HP bar animations, and everything that happened in a turn took place simultaneously. But then came the Pokemon Online simulator, and the HP bars being animated there. The Life Orb activation message was taken out of the log, which did indeed lead to some players caught off guard by the so-called invisible Life Orbs. Of course, then Pokemon Showdown took over as a simulator, and that incorporated both HP bar animation and the 10% recoil message into its battle log. So now if you missed both, you were really sleepwalking through your battle. Gen 4 Life Orb was also rendered truly invisible because recoil did not activate when hitting a substitute. This was changed in Generation 5, much to the displeasure of the Gen 4 faithful. This makes it too easy to substall opposing Life Orb attackers, they clamored. Now, a substitute Breloom, for instance, would be even more threatening to the Life Orb Gengar trying to check it. Of course, the upside was that newer gen players going back to Gen 4 would often find themselves bewildered when, say, a Gengar would attack their Breloom substitute, take no Life Orb damage, and then reveal itself to be Life Orb when its devastatingly powerful next attack made contact against a non-substitute. So many of these mechanical changes came about in Gen 5, making Gen 4 seem like a sort of quaint end of an era, even though it actually introduced so many of these mechanics. And our next choice is 4th Gen as well, in which U-turn shenanigans or breaking the substitute doesn't make Intimidate work. A deep cut tends to reveal itself to even experienced players only after they've plundered every depth of their metagame's intricacies. Playing around DPP Breloom is profoundly irritating and usually doesn't involve one perfect counter so much as a collection of multiple half checks having to work in tandem to stave it off. It's especially obnoxious when it uses Substitute to scout your switches, but the fact that it has to reveal it's using Focus Punch means that you can potentially break the sub with a U-turn before switching a check, assuming the U-turn user doesn't get walloped by a subless Focus Punch on the switch. But hey, you don't exactly have safer options, or you'd use them. Anyway, you've sacrificed something to sleep, and you've got, say, Scizor in on a subbed up Loom. As you go for U-turn, it reveals it's tightening its focus, and you say, perfect, this means I can get my Gyarados in to get the Intimidate off and take the resisted Focus Punch as opposed to the neutral Seed Bomb. It was a complicated dance of Pokemon, but you managed to take minimal damage. Or so you thought. In this case, if you wanted to intimidate the Breloom, you should have gone right to Gyarados on the substitute turn. Here's the catch. In Gen 4, if you break a sub with U-turn and switch to an Intimidate Pokemon, the Intimidate does not go off. It's rather a rare situation to encounter, since most of the time, if you're looking to intimidate something, you just go right to the Intimidate Pokemon, right? True, but playing around opposing Pokemon and circumstantial specificities of a battle sometimes takes all manner of switches improvised on the fly, especially since one U-turn doesn't always break some subs. And so if you play a lot of DPP, you may very well eventually find yourself U-turning out of a substitute and wanting to then intimidate that sub user with your Gyarados, whether it's Breloom, Physical Jirachi, or even an opposing Gyarados. Except you can't, which is a shame. Especially if you're trying to U-turn and intimidate your way around a subbing Pokemon, you could clearly use the extra help. This was changed in Generation 5, just in time for Landorus Therian to hit the scene. As a bonus, here's another U-turn moment from Diamond and Pearl only. If you U-turn and switch into a Pokemon with a choice item that also knows U-turn, it will automatically be forced into using U-turn as the next move without selecting any for itself. Glitch or design looped, it was removed with the arrival of Platinum. Now we're going to go back to the first 3 generations, in which feinting is good, actually. You could actually turn the opponent's spikes against them in Gens 2 and 3, and in those two, as well as the spikes lacking Gen 1, use Explosion in ways that could not be replicated after. Now, this one's quite not as obscure as the other mechanics on this list, but they certainly are alien to any new gen sensibilities. In the first 3 generations, a turn is declared over as soon as a Pokemon faints. This means in certain situations, you can use your Pokemon fainting as a way of preventing your opponent from making a move. In Gen 4, you can't go first and explode on something with, say, Azo. If you come up short, you can still make their move. This effectively means almost nothing if you went for a damaging move like Crunch, but it is significant in that they can still do things like set up Stealth Rock or Substitute. Now take a threat like Gen 3 Calm Mind Rest Suicune, which quickly becomes nigh unbreakable after a boost. You'll chip away at it with free damage, but it always just seems to heal it off, and that's where Explosion becomes more than just a source of big burst damage. Gengar and its low attack stat aren't exactly bowling over Suicune's titanic physical bulk, even with the defense having effect Explosion has in the first 4 generations. But what it does do is declare the turn finished as soon as it faints, meaning it damages Suicune and doesn't give it an opportunity to rest the damage off, which, should Gengar time the hit right against a chipped Suicune, might be just what's needed to finish it off with a teammate like Aerodactyl or Dugtrio. Suicune was just the tip of the iceberg. A sacrificial Explosion could be just as valuable in cutting off recovery from Celebi, stifling a Dragoness from Tyranitar, or whatever you needed, less about the damage than about denying them their turn. While Explosion could do this, it wasn't the only way. In some extremely specific cases, a Dragon Dance boosted Gyarados could pull the same with recoil from its double edge. More commonly though, was utilizing your opponent's multiple layers of spikes against them. The 25% per switch of a Skarmory that had gotten all 3 layers up was often suffocating, but the one source of respite was that, in a tight situation, on a crucial turn, you could sacrifice your Pokemon to those spikes and deny them whatever they needed. Blissey was getting worn down, but now it's about to heal back up and become unbreakable again? Nope, sacrifice your Pokemon to spikes, and that soft-boiled isn't going off. Tyranitar's about to DD and sweep you? Not if you sack your Pokemon to spikes, letting you freely finish it off with your low-health Heracross. Turning your opponent's strengths against them is always a joy. See Trick Room, and this is among the most satisfying of such maneuvers. Now it's time to fittingly finish off with a bang, literally, as we're talking about end-of-battle moments, many involving Explosion, in which both remaining Pokemon may faint on the final turn, but who wins depends on the generation. In the first 4 generations, it's simple. There's a tie. You can explode, Destiny Bond, be finished off by your own Life Orb, whatever. If both Pokemon faint at the end of the battle, the battle is declared a tie. In live formats where a tie wasn't a satisfying result and there wasn't time to replay, self-KO clause, which was in effect right from the earliest in-person Japanese tournaments, would determine the user of the element that KO'd their own Pokemon as the loser. However, in non-live tour simulator play, self-KO clause didn't apply, and ties were recognized as valid, whether they were accepted as a result in and of themselves or called for a replay. This tended to cause a great deal of confusion for newer gen players who came from a world without ties. That's right, when Gen 5 came around, things really got complicated because ties were removed from the game. Now there was simply win or loss, and seeing as such tight finishes were rare, even experienced players would struggle to remember what constituted a win or loss. Following the spirit of self-KO clause, if your last Pokemon used Explosion to KO the opponents, you would lose. But seeing as Explosion had been nerfed into near non-use outside specific lead strategies, this wasn't anything to worry about. In a similar vein, a successful last turn Destiny Bond would also lead to a loss for the Destiny Bond user. Gen 5's mechanics weren't just a copy of self-KO clause though, as on the other hand, if you KO'd your opponent and were finished off by your own recoil, whether from Life Orb or say Flare Blitz, you would still win. The one that really tended to cause confusion at the end of a tight battle though were the contact punishers, Iron Barbs, Rough Skin, and Rocky Helmet. Perhaps it was the latent Gen 4 mentality thinking about ties, perhaps it was the heat and the rush of a battle, or perhaps the fact that for a time Pokemon Online and even Pokemon Showdown actually had ties coded in as late as Gen 6. Whatever it was, players' minds tended to get awfully clouded when this scenario started to loom as a possibility. It always seemed like the Pokemon that attacks to finish the opposing Pokemon should be the winner, even if it succumbs to Rocky Helmet or Iron Barbs, because it got the KO, right? Well, it's actually the opposite. The Pokemon with the damaging item or ability is the winner in this scenario. If a 1% Terrakion close combats a Ferrothorn for the KO, the Ferrothorn user is the winner. This one is confusing, but it's all about activation order, and the Contact Punisher kicks in before the Contact Punisher goes down. What a finish. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Gylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardeen, Zathor for their major support of our videos.